So hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar where we're going to be exploring some of the concepts on mitigation hierarchy, offsetting, and nature positive. My name is Marcos Valderrano, and I work in the IUCN Secretariat based in Switzerland, supporting especially the Red List of ecosystems, but with a very strong interest in how do we design adequate frameworks for impact mitigation, ecological compensation that allow us for reasonable, comprehensive, measurable tools on the ground? So the session today is going to be composed of three relatively short presentations, 10, 15 minutes more or less. And then we'll have a question, space for questions and answers and debate. So we have intentionally designed the three presentations as follows. We will start first with a general framework on what is nature positive, what is the mitigation hierarchy, and where does offsetting sits within this. So kind of a conceptual understanding that we are all using these terms in a similar way. Because we are hearing now everything is nature positive here, nature positive there, and making sure that we understand the same things when we use the same terms all is very important. And then the next two presentations will be on concrete cases and examples and practical tools used for projects on the ground for promoting the application of the mitigation hierarchy and towards a nature positive future in a concrete setups. So we have intentionally wanted to give most of the space to concrete tools and resources that can be applied on the ground, and that's why most of the time will be invested. So with further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speaker. So Luis Sanchez is professor in the University of Sao Paulo, and he will be providing the first presentation, setting up the framework and helping us navigate into this glossary of terms that are very often confusing, and hopefully it will not be so after the next 10 or 15 minutes. So thank you very much, Professor Sanchez, and over to you.
Thank you, Marcos, for organizing the meeting and inviting me. So I will make a short presentation. I'll share my screen.
I wonder if this is one of the challenges of the direct when we play in a concert.
Yeah, he does look frozen.
Let's give Luis Sanchez another 20 seconds or so to see if that's just temporary. If not, we will change the order of the presentations, which will not be ideal because the order does matter in this context. We were doing test just 15 minutes ago and that worked perfectly, but that's part of the challenges. Okay, last 10 seconds, Luis. If it doesn't solve in 10 seconds, I may have to ask the next speaker to step forward. So the next speaker after Luis is going to be Amre von Hasse. Amre it's working with Wildlife Conservation Society South Africa, and is also the co-chair from the IMEC group, the Impact Mitigation and Ecological Compensation Group, which is part of the Commission on Ecosystem Management. So it's the part of the Commission leading with particularly these issues. But Amre has extensive experience of practical application on this, especially through the combo program. So let's give a last chance for Luis to reconnect now that he's back. And if
I'm
not,
back here.
we jump into Ambre's presentation. Thank you, Ambre, I see that
I'm
you
back
switched on
here.
your
Can you
camera.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you back.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. It's a problem with our power system. We have a private company that supplies electricity to the whole city, and the service has been very, very poor. Many people have been complaining, and that's another example. I'm sorry for that. Exactly when I was trying to start my presentation. So apologies. I am now connected through the 4G system. Well, so let's start. I was saying that I will make the short presentation, and the basis for it is the impact assessment process, environmental impact assessment, and the mitigation hierarchy has been underpinning impact assessment theory and practice since its beginning, since its inception. We can date the initial institutionalization of impact assessment in 1969 by the introduction of then a new law in the United States. Then the ideas spread all over the world. Most countries, or almost all countries, have currently laws requiring assessment of the impacts of new developments, new projects, especially when they are considered to have the potential to cause significant impacts. The idea of preventing impacts is really at the basis of the whole conception of environmental and then environmental and social impact assessment. It's an excerpt of the purpose of this US law, and it's clearly mentioning that the purpose is to prevent damage, to prevent harmful impacts. So what we call today the mitigation hierarchy, although these terms were not used as such at that time, is basically or essentially the idea that the purpose of planning for new projects, advancing their potential impacts, and then how do we can act to mitigate those impacts is really the basis, the foundation of impact assessment. However, practices show it that this application of this avoidance or preventing perspective when we are assessing the impacts of a new project has several limits. There are many reasons to explain why many impacts cannot be fully avoided. And in practice, impact assessment has been implemented basically using what we call today a paradigm of controlled loss. That means we accept losses in the natural environment, the physical environment, biodiversity, flora, fauna, landscape, and so on. And in exchange, we have economic goals, economic gains, like jobs or more taxes or more development. And impact
Luis,
assessment has been
Luis,
operating.
sorry,
Yes, yes, please.
we are not seeing your screen. I think you are not sharing the screen. So yeah, if you can share.
You try. Yes, thanks for advising me. I thought I had started sharing, but where is it now? Sorry for all those. Again, so full screen, allow, PowerPoint. Can you see it now?
Perfect, thanks. Just yeah.
So
Yes, we can see it.
sorry again for that. That was I was using as the basis and excerpt of the law I was mentioning to. So this idea, this paradigm of controlled loss has been in practice applied in impact assessment all over the world, and it's considered now to be standard practice. But we face challenges that have been accumulating over the years, in particular the challenge related to the steep and important and continuous loss of biodiversity, as exemplified in this figure that calls for actions to what has been called being called like bending the curve of continuous biodiversity loss. Impact assessment should have a role to play in this new or this more structured goal that is currently underpinned, for example, by the Convention on Biological Diversity, in particular, the so-called Coming Montreal targets that came out from the last international conference of parties on biological diversity. So the application of the mitigation hierarchy has to be seen in this context. Its main field, not only, but the main field of application is in making decisions about projects. Impact assessment is the main tool internationally used for informing the decision makers and stakeholders about the impacts and the decisions that should be made in terms of proceeding or not, and which conditions should be applied to new projects. And the mitigation hierarchy so is the basis for informing those decisions. Biodiversity offsets in general and biodiversity offsets in particular are considered to be one step or the last step in the mitigation hierarchy. So the priority is to avoid impacts, to minimize or reduce harmful impacts. These are also called to be the preventative steps of the mitigation hierarchy. And later comes actions towards restoring or correcting for harmful impacts. And finally, offsetting. Offsetting should be applied only to projects that cannot be avoided or cannot be sufficiently reduced. The concepts of offsets, principles about offsets, and the practical examples have been developed over the past almost 20 years. Examples are on the screen. The important work prepared and systematized by an initiative called BBOP, Biodiversity Business and Biodiversity Offsets Program, with a group of multilateral development banks, international non-government organizations, business sectors. The purpose of applying offsets to achieve, next slide I'll talk about, to achieve at least no net loss of biodiversity. It's also enshrined in several important documents. One example is the performance standards, environmental and social sustainability performance standards of the International Finance Corporation. Later, its first version was published in 2006, second version in 2012, and later used or improved or adopted by many other financial institutions, not only multilateral financial institutions, but also private banks, which are members of the so-called Equator Principles associations. IUCN has played a role also in establishing ideas, principles for the practice of biodiversity offsetting. There is a policy. IUCN issued a policy on biodiversity offsets almost 10 years ago. The basic concept, the sources, let's say, agree on this common definition. Offsets are measurable conservation outcomes designed to compensate for adverse and unavoidable impacts of projects. So unavoidable is important, and that means that biodiversity offsets make sense only in the context of the mitigation hierarchy. So the mitigation hierarchy is a sequence, is an order of preference of planning actions that should be employed when planning a project. So actions or solutions to avoid impacts should be the first and foremost goal when a project is being planned. Well, that's in the context, of course, that impact assessment is not only a rubber stamp for a project, but a planning tool in where we have environmental and social specialists, experts working with the project planners, with engineers, architects, and other project planners in order to find the best options and selecting the best alternatives to meet the project goals. So offsets and the mitigation hierarchy makes sense in that context. We normally say that the purpose or the goal of offsets are to achieve at least no net loss. It's exemplified in this figure that shows. I'm trying to find a pointer. Shows for a hypothetical, in this case, mining project, that from the beginning of the project you have a certain level of biodiversity, you have losses as the project proceeds, and progressively you can achieve partial gains through actions such as restoring affected lands or restoring areas outside the project footprint that have been affected by other human actions and connected and related to the project. And if everything goes well, you could achieve an equivalent level of biodiversity as you had at the beginning. And the idea or the point, the no net loss is, as a concept, means a point in a trajectory. You go in a recovery trajectory and you should go beyond that. And if you can go beyond, you would get to, you will achieve net gains. And that's why the goals of no net loss and net gains are often presented together. As this figure also intends to represent, there is what we call a time lag between the moment that biodiversity loss starts, because you started project actions, and when you can achieve recovery, full recovery, again, if everything goes well and you work well in terms of restoring composition, functions, and other characteristics of the biodiversity or ecosystems you affected. So one of the limits of application, applying the biodiversity offsets at project level, is that often gains come later. Even if you work, and that's normally what is expected, when you work offsite in areas that are beyond the project boundaries. More recently, we have been talking about nature positive and nature positive outcomes. If you remember the bending the curve figure I had projected from a source in the beginning of this presentation, we are on a decline tendency, and the idea or the goal, the purpose of initiatives that could be taken today would be to restore kind of same level of nature in about 5 years, when this idea started to be developed and formalized, and then progressively achieve more gains in order to have a better, or let's say, or as many sources say, more nature in the future than we have now. This is the concept or a definition that comes from another important initiative that's called Nature Positive Initiative. Again, putting together different interests, business, development banks, non-government organizations, and other important players and actors. And this poses a new, sets the goal or sets the bar at a higher level than, I would say, only mitigation hierarchy in terms of achieving no net loss. This definition of nature positive that comes from a IUCN publication. So it's presented as a goal, global and societal goal, aiming at halting and reversing the loss of nature. And halting and reversing, that's important, it's about avoiding and minimizing impact. So that's the first and second steps of the mitigation hierarchy, but also restoring and regenerating nature. To achieve nature positive outcomes, the application of the mitigation hierarchy should go through all the steps, all the spectrum, and that means that actions, conservation actions, restoration actions are necessary if a project is intended to contribute to nature positive outcomes. So restoring and regenerating nature is understood as a set of actions that normally are taken outside a project footprint, so necessarily in partnership, collaboration with third parties. And they are a necessary action, a necessary group of actions if the goal is to achieve nature positive outcomes. And that it's a reference to our recent project we're closing with IUCN, which is called the Benefits from Restoration. Marx will talk about that a bit later. All sectors, all actors, but in particular businesses have a role to play as a contribution or contributing to achieving nature positive. There's a deadline, a proposed deadline that's aligned with the Kunming Montreal targets. That's why it's 2030. That means, and I'm concluding now, that goals for impact assessment and for considering the harmful and the beneficial impacts of projects have become more ambitious a long time. And that's because challenges are more complex. And that's because we're living in a world where we're losing biodiversity and nature every day. So from the initial idea of impact assessment of minimizing losses, we evolved, let's say, to the idea of counterbalancing unavoidable losses with equivalent gains, which is the basis or the logic behind no net loss. There has also been a lot of talk about generating net positive impact. So net gain, net positive impacts are similar concepts. They are close together. So we have more ambitious goals where we are looking at leaving positive legacies. Positive legacies in this context means that overall we're not in a worse off situation when a project is implemented and through its life cycle, but in a better situation, or as in some parts of the world, legislation has been advancing the idea of how those projects contribute to sustainability. And that includes this nature positive purpose. So a project would not become nature positive. It can be achieve no net loss or net gain, but it could also, and that's the challenge and what has been called by these organizations that I mentioned, that a project or a company, business could contribute to nature positive outcomes. And that requires, so firstly, the full application of the mitigation hierarchy. Full application means that you really need to put your effort in the initial steps, avoiding and minimizing. You need to work with stakeholders. That's no new stuff for companies, but maybe more clear challenge and call to actions for businesses today is to use their leverage power in order to mobilize other sectors, other actors, looking or aiming at a certain region, contributing together to nature positive outcomes. So that's the introduction, the initial presentation. Apologies again for the technical or connection problems in the beginning. So that was not due to internet services, but to energy, electricity. Do you still see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Stop share. Okay, I found it. So
Thank you very much, Luis. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that set up the framework for the main elements that we want to keep elaborating now with a more practical tools on the nature positive framework, and within that, how do we apply the mitigation hierarchy and offsetting and so on. So our next speaker, Ambre von Hasse from Wildlife Conservation Society, South Africa, very engaged in the IMEC group also. Is going to be talking about some of those practical tools that have been developed within the Combo program. So over to you, Ambre. Yeah, we can see your screen very well, but we cannot hear you yet. I need to unmute.
There we go.
Yes, there you go.
All
Over to you.
good. Hello. Yes, I'm here. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I am lucky to be representing both the Combo project, which I've been leading for the Wildlife Conservation Society over the past 4 years, as well as IMEC. As Marcos said, I'm a co-chair of IMEC. And what I'd like to do is present to you some of the work that we've done over the past few years on the mitigation hierarchy, no net loss, net gain, and nature positive, and in particular focus on some of the outputs and resources that we've produced, which we can share with a wide audience. So Luis, luckily, has done a lot of the heavy lifting on the theoretical and key concepts around no net loss, net gain, and similar goals. So I don't need to delve into that in any detail. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just introduce what is IMEC and what is Combo, and then show you some of the work that we've done, especially under Combo, and some of the resources, as I said earlier. So IMEC is the Impact Mitigation and Ecological Compensation Group. It's a community of practice under the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management. It's a thematic group. And it is chaired by Martine Moron at the moment still, from the University of Queensland, and Fabien Quetier and myself. We are co-chairs of this group. Currently, we have over 280 members from all different parts of the world, and they come from different sectors, business, government, civil society, etc. And what we do is we work on developing and sharing information and training materials and policy updates, etc., on best practice in the mitigation hierarchy and net outcomes. And here's a snippet here of our website and one of the outputs that we've produced on Nature Positive for business. But now I will focus on the Conservation, Mitigation and Biodiversity Offsets Program, COMBO, all these acronyms. So what is COMBO? COMBO is a project that has been funded by the Agence Française de Développement and the Fonds Français pour l'Environnement Mondial over the past 8 years. And it's implemented by the Wildlife Conservation Society together with other partners like Biotope, Biofund, which is a conservation trust fund in Mozambique, as well as other partners. And we have been working across 6 countries in Africa and Asia. You can see them on this map here. Here's our website. In order to strengthen and establish national mitigation systems, and supporting their rollout, so the rollout of policy in these countries. So what's important here is that we are not working just at the project level, but we are actually working at the national level to really scale up outcomes from the mitigation hierarchy. The aim ultimately is to align no net loss and net gain outcomes at the project level with broader biodiversity goals and targets, both at the national level and at the international level. The work has been highly collaborative, not just between the partners, but also with governments, with the private sector, and with civil society in each of these countries. The approach that we've taken, led by our government partners, together with their other key stakeholders, has been, as I said, to advance policy on the mitigation hierarchy in each of these countries. That's important because a regulatory trigger is really key for action. But policy alone is not enough, so we need a lot of enabling conditions. We need an enabling framework for success. So it's essential to take quite a comprehensive approach to this, and this is where these different pillars sit in that you see here on the screen. Other elements to put in place are really around data and tools, spatial data, for example, to improve planning and implementation of the mitigation hierarchy, data sharing platforms at a national level, so that all users have access to this information. Also, really important is to build capacity. So we've been preparing training materials and doing capacity building of many different user groups across various different levels. And last but not least, we have been focusing on preparing and, to the extent possible, testing mechanisms for implementation, in particular for compensation, which is one of the most challenging steps in the mitigation hierarchy. So this approach was taken in every country, so on a country-by-country basis, and was obviously adapted and rolled out in a context-dependent way. At a cross-cutting level across the 6 countries, there was an international team, the Combo International team, which prepared guidance to feed into the country-by-country processes, and also prepared, for example, some of the training materials that could then be adapted in each country, and importantly, synthesis reports of the experience in each of the countries. And the important thing about that is that this can be shared, beyond the borders, between the Combo countries, but also beyond the Combo countries, so that other governments and other stakeholders can really benefit from this information. So some of this was done together with IMEC. Some of the resources were produced together with IMEC, and also with the IUCN, for example, with the Red List team and with the Business and Biodiversity team. All our resources, and they are still being prepared, some of them are being hosted on the Combo website. I've put a QR code here so you can take a look, and a link as well. And I'll just give a few examples to illustrate what we have produced. So one of the examples, and this is a little bit of a synthesis output, is we have prepared a lessons learned from policy development and implementation across 4 of the Combo countries. So these were the countries that really went through both phases of Combo since 2016. And that looks at really what is needed for success at the national level to make these mitigation systems work. What's the experience in the countries been? So we have a full report on that, and then we've prepared a summary brochure which is a 2-pager basically, which sort of presents snippets of what are these key lessons learned. Secondly, and this was a fully collaborative effort with the IMEC group, we have prepared technical briefs on everything you want to know about the mitigation hierarchy. For example, what is the mitigation hierarchy and why do we need it? How do we align it with broader goals, global goals? How does it relate to nature positive? Impact assessment and the mitigation hierarchy, emphasizing the need for considering people as well as biodiversity. So all of these, you see the topics listed here, look like this, and they have been prepared. They are 3 or 4 short pages, really to just give an introduction. And myself, I actually go to these on a regular basis just to be able to send them to somebody with a short explanation of, for example, loss gain calculations in the mitigation hierarchy. Another example is a series of videos on biodiversity offsets. So this was prepared previously by members of various universities, but also of IMEC and Combo. And it's a series of videos that explain all sorts of different elements relating to these this most controversial step in the mitigation hierarchy, biodiversity offsets. And the Combo project was responsible for translating these, doing voiceovers into different languages. So we now have these really useful little videos in French, with Portuguese subtitles, in a Mandarin version, and we're preparing additional language versions of these as well. And then we have synthesis reports. So we have synthesis reports that focus on technical aspects of the mitigation hierarchy. So these are longer ones. For example, I've put one here, biodiversity mapping and the mitigation hierarchy. So this is about how key biodiversity areas or the red list of ecosystems also can be used to inform application of the mitigation hierarchy at different scales, for example. So that's one of the outputs. And then a very interesting one that is still in production at the moment is a synthesis report on the last component that I presented earlier on the implementation mechanisms. So what that report does is it synthesizes the experience across all of the countries in implementing conservation, restoration, and compensation projects, and the different mechanisms that are really needed for success. What it includes as well is lessons from 4 pilot projects that we conducted in Mozambique specifically to test these implementation mechanisms. And by that, I mean, for example, what are the kinds of management plans that would be needed to be drawn up to have successful implementation in the field? How can performance and incentive-based contracts be entered into with communities to support restoration as part of the mitigation hierarchy? So those are the kinds of practical tools that we were looking for under this last component. And we have at a sort of country by country level also prepared some case studies with a focus on particular projects. And with that, I will end here and thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Amber. That was really good. I cannot recommend more all the resources that you mentioned, but especially if someone wants to get started with these, the videos of the IMEC group and the issue briefs of the combo program. They are both fantastic resources to get a dive into all these concepts. There is a bunch of other a bit more advanced, but those two are fantastic to get very clear, concrete, straight to the point recommendations on how to apply both. I've personally used them a lot, and I think they're really, really well done. So I strongly recommend you IMAC website and Combo program website host them. So the last presentation of today, it's going to be myself, and I'm going to be providing an overview of the materials that we've prepared as part of the before program that reads for benefits from restoration. And center layout, here we go, share. There we go. I hope you all can see my screen. So very briefly, because I think we are running out of time, I'm going to be presenting 4 small briefs / short publications and 2 courses in the IUCN Academy, all related to the topic that we've been talking about. So within this project, we wanted to dig into 2 type of questions. The green questions, which are more about how do we build bridges between restoration and the mitigation hierarchy, thinking that in the future, business are going to be building bridges between business and restoration. And how do we provide a framework that helps that setup? And the second component, which is more how do we make sure that the offsetting, mitigation hierarchy, and all these framework is adequately considered in the application of the nature positive goals that are so in vogue at the moment. So the first question that we wanted to answer is, if we want restoration projects to be used in the context of impact mitigation and ecological compensation, we need to measure social outcomes, outcomes of restoration in general. And we realized that there are a lot of metrics and tools to measure ecological outcomes of restoration projects, but very rarely restoration projects were measuring social outcomes of restoration. And it's not because there is a lack of tools and resources that allow you to measure those social outcomes. It's because those are dispersed and very rarely used. So what we've done with this first short brief is to compile the existing frameworks that measure social outcomes of restoration projects and put them up together and try to categorize and organize what that was, what is better for which purpose, and organize it based on some key social achievements. So the objective is, at the end, restoration projects would be measuring both ecological outcomes and social outcomes as part of their monitoring of impacts. So among other frameworks that we compile in this short publication, we have the nature-based solutions and the Society of Ecological Restoration Principles and the UN Decade Principles for Ecosystem Restoration, and a few others. We have not created a new framework, but basically compiled what exists and try to provide pros and cons. A completely different topic, but very related, is we realized by talking with some of the stakeholders that there was a very legitimate fear that companies were going to be skipping the mitigation hierarchy and all the protocols that have been setting up and in place for many years, and then jump directly into nature positive and say, I'm nature positive, skipping all the process that goes before. Surprisingly, IUCN there was a lot of reticence years ago about biodiversity offsets and the application of the mitigation hierarchy. And as a result of that, IUCN took a very significant effort in developing and approving the IUCN policy on biodiversity offsets. As a result, that framework is quite robust and resulted in the application of the mitigation hierarchy. But for the nature positive, because it's a societal goal, we haven't gone through such a robust process. So everyone is jumping into nature positive. So basically what we're trying to do is reiterate the message that the IMEC group has been screaming as much as possible, saying a nature positive goal needs to be based in and not replace the mitigation hierarchy. And to do that, we need to apply that first at the project level, then at the value chain level, and only after that we can aim towards a net positive or goal. So this key idea is what's reflected in this brief, a little bit more developed. We realized that part of the reasons why the biodiversity, the IUCN policy on biodiversity offsets is not so much looked at is that it's 10 years old and it's a bit of a tough document. So we wanted to make it more accessible. And for that, it's now compiled into a course into the IUCN Academy. That's the original text from 2016 that went through that massive IUCN consultation process. And now we've tried to capture that in a bit more interactive manner, linking to several of the videos that the Ambre was talking about that the IMEC has been developing, which are really fantastic, really didactic. Some a bit more quizzes and interactive questions, and a way to make it a bit more friendly for the user to go and dive in it. It's free and open into the IUCN Academies, and don't hesitate to go and have a look. The next element that we thought would require also a little bit more of digging was making sure that whenever we apply the mitigation hierarchy, ecosystems were considered as well as other biodiversity metrics. So traditionally, in many places, species considerations or the presence of threatened species, for example, are quite integrated into the process of evaluating impacts and then designing avoidance and mitigation and restoration and eventually offsetting for residual impacts procedures. But ecosystems, because it's a newer flu concept, are less easily integrated. So that's why we wanted to develop a specific brief explaining a step-by-step how would you take, for example, a red list of ecosystems map, and how would you use it to integrate the mitigation hierarchy in the avoidance phase, for example, here from a more threatened ecosystems to a more less threatened ones, then in minimization, for example, for the higher impacts, and then restoration, and finally offsetting for residual impacts. This is still quite theoretical, but it's many countries are still are already applying that at the different levels. Mozambique through the combo program is one of them, for example. But we wanted to provide more of a generic framework of how red list of ecosystems is integrated into the mitigation hierarchy. I'm just realizing I'm speaking a bit quick. Apologies for the translators. The last course I want to mention is a course in the IUCN Academy called Introduction to Mapping Biodiversity Priorities, which aims to compile most of the information within this publication, Mapping Biodiversity Priorities, that was led by South Africa National Biodiversity Institute and UNEP WCMC, and basically proposed a schema on how do we integrate information from species, abundance and threatened species through the red list, ecosystems distribution and threatened ecosystems through the red list of ecosystems, and then information on protected area, basically to design conservation and restoration priorities on the ground. It's very graphic, provides step-by-step recommendations, and it can be applied for country poor spaces where you don't have necessarily a very complete data set of biodiversity data. So highly recommended either the book or the IUCN academic course that summarize that in a more friendly way, but it's the same content. And finally, a small publication, we realized that building the bridge between restoration practitioners and business sector requires talking the similar language. And very often, restoration practitioners have been working for NGOs or using public funding, and they were using a logic that served this type of purpose. But certain countries, there is not such a strong tradition of working with, for, or together with the business sector that it aims to using another type of language. So it's restoration, for example, based on targets, measurable, etc. While restoration practitioners look at the time span they need to prevent in advance to getting whatever the plans are or whatever the planning is. So we realized that these both worlds were speaking a slightly different language, and we wanted to put in a publication where the restoration community explains to the business world what their needs are, and the business world tells to the restoration community what their needs are. So we try to build the bridges into this direction. And that's it. There is still many steps ahead. One of the main things needed ahead is getting ecosystem data to be able to apply there. The IUCN Rhino is providing concrete metrics going forward and propose a concrete integration of the IUCN species threat abatement and restoration into the planning and measurement on high integrity restoration measures. Red list of ecosystems will be integrated there probably very soon, but still the need for data, it's a key element there. I'm gonna stop my presentation there so we have at least a few minutes for questions and answers. I may ask now Luis and Ambre to switch on their cameras, and anyone to either raise your hand to ask a question or place your questions into the chat box if you prefer. See, there is a hand up. Clarice, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. My question is for Emery. I understand that in the Combo project you followed through some compensation or offsetting implementation in some of these countries. And I was wondering, because this is something that I'm facing actually in a project that I'm working in. Did you have a situation in which the developer had gains really close to the area of the development, pretty much in which would be the area of direct influence of the development project? And in this gain, they would call it compensation, but maybe it wouldn't be exactly it. But on the other hand, it doesn't really fit in the other steps of the mitigation hierarchy. Have you been through any situation like that?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, in general, I'm gonna answer it a little bit from a theoretical perspective, from experience with many different projects, actually beyond Combo as well. Is that while we often say is that biodiversity offsets or compensation should be elsewhere or removed from the site, that doesn't necessarily apply in all cases. Sometimes compensation can be delivered sometimes we're dealing with really big areas, very big concession areas that actually ideally lend themselves to delivering compensation within those areas as well. There's some provisos. It must not be affected by the project itself, even indirectly, because that is an obvious risk. And then, you know, the requirement for an offset or compensation is for it to last as long as the residual impacts. So the key really is to demonstrate gain, but then also demonstrate lasting gain. So if it is just gain that will not actually last over the long term, it's quite difficult to, you know, claim that as compensation. I think those factors are probably more important than precisely where it's located, because with some projects it can be suitable to locate it, you know, in the vicinity of the development project. So that is not necessarily the, you know, the best deciding factor. In Combo, an interesting thing was that we were not really looking at many different compensation offset projects that had been implemented according to best practice. We looked at many projects that had been implemented possibly prior to legislation coming into place. So we saw all sorts of different practice, which, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say is best practice, but it informed, you know, what practice really needs to look like. Maybe Luis wants to add to that question.
I think in the advantage of time, because we only have 1 more minute, I'm gonna suggest that we jump into one more question on the chat, which and then Luis and Clarissa, maybe you can follow up bilaterally on that particular question. So there is a question in the chat which I think it's interesting to clarify to the audience, either Luis or Ambre. It says, why do you think some private sector commit to nature positive agendas but not to no net loss? Anyone?
Well,
Yes, please, Luis.
I have a guess, not necessarily an answer. True positive are broader and more open in the sense that a company can contribute to nature positive alongside the other actors and then have some positive impact. But no net loss is something that linked to their own operations, but possibly also offsetting indirect impacts. And that be more difficult, more challenging, more expensive. The ways to measure, I would say, are challenging in both achieving no net loss. When the issue is how do you allocate the contribution, particularly plus gain. Well, for the sake of time, that's my thoughts.
Thank you very much. That's very good. But I suppose there is also a question of fashion. Now, nature positive is more on everybody's mouth, and let's see how long it lasts. Whether it's a new word that's going to last with us for a very long time, or whether it pass on to something new. But thank you, Luis. That makes a lot of sense. Any other final words, Ambre? Otherwise, I would like to close the meeting to be respectful of everybody's time.
Thank you. I put my response in the chat so that we can close.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you, Ambre. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate. If you have any questions, you could write to us. I'm going to put my email in the chat in case anyone has any question, and I can redirect to Ambre or Luis. But I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you for the interpreters. Fantastic work. And thank you, the IUCN Academy, for organizing and holding the microphones. I wish you all a very nice day. And yeah, see you next time.